So as an insert, let's answer one of those questions that someone's emailed in. There's a question here from Sebastian Melmoth, who's asked a question about a topic that I'm sure a lot of us with interest in the military area, we find always a little bit of a fascination, which is camouflage. And especially camouflage on uniforms, the fact we wear clothes that imitate the military or have been influenced by the military all the time, and vice versa, of course, and that's another topic that we can look at some point. But if you're sometimes, I know there's people out there, they're shooters or you're fishermen or you do other bits and pieces, but or you just buy second-hand military clothing because it's quite well constructed, it's on the surplus market, relatively cheap for what you get, and I'll point that out in a moment. But all these ideas behind it, you know, as well as its military function, what works, what doesn't, and why, as the question from Sebastian comes in, why did Britain decide to change in 2010 its camouflage for this new pattern, which is called multi-terrain pattern, or MTP as it got known as. Now, you can look at, we won't go into all the details about camouflage in terms of military uniforms. You know, British Army was using green uniforms back in Wellington's time because it was seen to be effective to, if you are a scout, etc., to be hidden as opposed to the red. In India, the British Army uses this phrase khaki. We tend to over here to use khaki as a sort of dusty brown colour. It could, the Americans tend to use the phrase olive drab, but we use that phrase khaki, and that's an Indian word that we transpose. And by the Boer War, the British Army, yes, they've used some khaki uniforms out in India. It's been seen that way. We've been dyeing uniforms as well. Even in India, they were dyeing uniforms at one point, lighter ones with tea. But by the Boer War, that khaki service dress has been adopted. And again, it's this interesting bit. We always, when we use the word camouflage, we think of multi-coloured garments or patterns on vehicles, but of course just green itself or khaki is in essence a camouflage in itself and is still very, very effective on its own that way. It was only in the Second World War that Britain starts using certain bits of equipment that are purposely camouflaged in terms of the uniform side of things. The Italians, early 1930s, they've already got a camouflage ground sheet they're using. The Germans copy that idea with the Z-Bahn. And of course, you know, a number of nations bring in different camouflage patterns. The Germans, enormous numbers in the Second World War. Britain, 1941, we always tend to use that as a start point for camouflage on the British item of clothing, the paratroopers' Denison smock. And it's this big, broad brush stroke, sometimes said to be literally done with big brushes on the material, which was then cut up and made into the Denison smock. Interesting subject. We can look at that one at another time as well. But the Denison smock is credited to a captain, sometimes a major, as a rank Denison. The problem we've got, and if you look in a number of the books, sometimes they'll say who worked as part of the camouflage unit with Oliver Messel, who was a stage designer, theatrical designer, etc. The problem we've got is no one's ever been able to pin down who is this Captain or Major Denison, and we're not too sure he really existed. So where did that come from, and where's Denison, the name, being put on? Because of course the labels will only say smock, parachutist, etc., that sort of thing. But another topic, we don't want to go on too long about these ones. So Britain starts using that as a camouflage in 1941 on the Denison smock. We do a similar camouflage for a windproof smock that's used later, issued to not just special forces we tend to associate it with, but it was actually issued to Northwest Army Group, 21st Army Group in Northwest Europe. Trousers and tops there was a camouflage using the same pattern. Tank suit was being issued as well. So the idea is it's it's used in the Second World War, but we tend to go back to a standard green or khaki after the Second World War. And camouflage seems to be for only specialist operations or similar. What happens, though, mid-1960s, and if you look at Brass's book of camouflage, they suggest that it's a series of artists are invited in by the British Ministry of Defence to make suggestions of potential camouflage patterns that can be issued as a standard uniform for everyday wear, not just special operations or campaigns, as it were. Finn, go and get it. Go on, where's it gone? I've not found out any more on that, who these artists were, but again, perhaps out there, people could give us references to this if you know more. But that idea is that they come up with what we now know of, or was called back then, disruptive pattern material, DPM. And that is put out there in 66. It really goes into service. Looking at the different dates, you'll see people wear it in 68, 1970, pretty much the whole army's now in DPM material. And that's this pattern that's on this dummy beside me, on this smock. Much later issue, this one's probably 1990s smock. It's a pattern that initially uses about 4 colours, but it changes over time. And why I mention that is because, again, this idea about why we get into camouflage is, number one is, yes, that overall idea behind it, temperate climate, it's looked at by the British as being, leave it, drop it, as being going to be used in Northwest Europe. I say Northwest Europe, but really NATO, British forces facing the Soviet threat in the Cold War. Their thoughts are Germany, the woodlands, etc., that sort of area. So that's what that major thought process behind disruptive pattern material that we're used to seeing all the time. But they also realise actually what it's doing is it's breaking up a standard single colour. We can change those colours for other circumstances. So there's a tropical version that's done as well, with other colours going in there, greens, reds, etc. And we also then design a desert version. And the pattern is very, very popular. British Army becomes pretty much the first army in the world that has a camouflage uniform as standard for everyday wear. And it's picked up on by not just other colonial countries, etc. and everything, but it's picked up on by a lot of dozens of countries all around the world end up using a version of DPM material, sometimes with their own mix of colours, sometimes with slight adjustments, etc., to meet their own circumstances, etc. Now, one of the problems Britain has is actually does a 3-colour disruptive pattern material that we sell, and one of the countries that's bought that is Iraq. And when we go to fight in Iraq, we have a real problem there because we were going to, again, have that type of DPM issued in large quantities to British forces. We changed the idea because we just didn't like the idea still of an enemy wearing exactly the same uniform pattern or camouflage on that uniform that the British forces were going to be using, which is why, and hidden behind me here on the chair, is this is what we came out with instead, which is the 2-tone desert disruptive pattern material that we end up using when we go to fight in Iraq, because it's a different one and we do that way. So if you look at, and again, that business about getting into the subtleties of this, the colours change, not just because of the manufacturer, the dye mix, etc., but we think there are changes in the actual colour charts issued. And if you really get into it, there's some enthusiasts that have picked out 66, 68, 84, 1990 and 1994 as what you might call key variants in that, or identifiable variants in that issue of disruptive pattern material by the British forces. And it's a very, very effective camouflage scheme. And of course, it's still being used by the British military. In the early 2000s, British forces serve in Iraq, where, again, this scheme is considered very effective for the nature of the terrain, the sort of background they're entering, the fighting going on there. This is considered very good. But by about 2009, there's questions being raised about whether this scheme or this scheme is really working effectively in Afghanistan. And one of the surveys, one of the things they look at is this is absolutely brilliant if you are in woodland and temperate, and areas of Afghanistan, almost jungle-like, especially if you're looking around Helmand province where there's lots of irrigation, lots of areas there where this works very, very well. But once you're away from the wooded and the vegetation and the cultivated areas, all of a sudden, you're standing out. It becomes the opposite of effective. You really are drawing attention to yourself with those darker colours there. And it's the same, really. They found this absolutely great in Iraq, fantastic for those lighter hues, the desert backgrounds, the sandy colours, etc. But as soon as you go into a green area or an urban area in certain other places, this doesn't really work very well. So the message comes back in 2009, what can we do? What can we come up with something or something else? Which leads, of course, to trying to answer that question, the MTP story. Now, one of the chaps that you really have to bring in now as part of this is he got to Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Tresidder, Royal Engineer, served in Afghanistan, was part of, answering those surveys, coming back. His next job was he was offered Chief of Staff for the Defence Clothing Team based at Bath. And he comes into play there where they're doing, in the background, there's something called Operation Peacock going on. They're looking at the uniforms that the British Army are using, and they're looking at that as making sure that they interact. So Soldier 95 looks at probably for the first time how all those different layerings, how all those different bits of uniform, how do they come together along with your load carrying equipment and then of course body armour. With Operation Peacock, they're really going into this a lot more detail. And some of the issues that are thrown up from this are things like you don't want necessarily buttons or zips on bits of uniform that you might be wearing underneath, for example, body armour, because then you get points of pressure, rubbing, chafing, etc., and things that way. So that was one of the things Operation Peacock was doing. But as with all these things in MOD areas, it tends to drift a bit, sometimes loses its way, sometimes, money runs out or whatever. But because of the fighting in Afghanistan, the issue about clothing and loss of life, it helps draw that attention. So one of the things Tresidder was able to do was to take evidence that the need for a better camouflage system and a camouflage that would work in a number of circumstances. It might not be as good as this for that temperate, wooded or jungle-like terrain, but actually it will be better overall in the different types of terrains that you've got in Afghanistan. They really are very varied there. So that leads to a series of experimentation. They get in DSTL, Defence Scientific Technical Laboratories, the MOD's kind of scientific advisors. They look at a number of patterns that are being touted. Already you've got special forces in the UK are starting to use one of the multicam patterns. There's a lot of countries are now looking at or have actually issued digital camouflage schemes. And what they do is they do a very clever tests with DSTL, and they get soldiers in to look at photograph screens where basically the different camouflages are dropped in. And you're obviously it's done very cleverly so that you don't look at the same place twice thinking, and it's basically the idea is you press a button as soon as you recognise where you think there's an outline form of a human. And the longer, if it takes up something like 30 seconds, the argument was you're almost invisible. Whereas some of these things, it's a second, boom, it's literally to the hand to go to the button sort of thing. So some things jump out. So they look at that in a scientific manner. They get into contact with a company that's got its name in this area, a very new company, only set up in 1999, by two young graduates, actually, from an American university, who get into the idea of, they're called Cry Precision Engineering, and they get into the idea of camouflage, a number of other areas as well, looking at what other things might come forward. And Cry and Tresida get together and they start talking about coming up with using a multicam, in other words, a camouflage scheme that could be used in a number of different, come here, Finn, drop it, a number of different circumstances, and what might be the best way of trying to do that, what colour tones, and these tones again are looked at by DSTL to come up with a selection. A selection is then in the summer of 2010 put to Warminster. 200 soldiers are invited along. Come and have a look at these. These are ones we've done some tests on. These are better than these ones, etc. They're given a bit of evidence. But what's your opinion? And one of the things Tresida's very good at is explaining the fact that we can do all the science, but as with so many things, if it doesn't work with the troops, we're wasting our times. If people feel foolish about a colour scheme, or they don't think it's, like the British Army has this phrase, alley kit, and there was lots of issues about alley kit in Afghanistan. In other words, it's the cool stuff. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel better about myself. It helps me. It might give me confidence. It's all sorts of things come into that psychological element of the clothing you're wearing and what it does to you. And the military are very conscious of that. Think of that over time. I always love that story when they were filming Oh, What a Lovely War. They were doing the read-throughs. No one got it. And then all of a sudden they put on all the uniforms and suddenly they were strutting about, shoulders back, heads up, peak caps on, etc. And they were getting some of that, what were the authors were trying to get across on that. And that's what uniforms can do for you. And, another whole issue to talk about there at some point. But Caleb Cry and Tresida, they've come up with one, and Tresida puts it to all the guys. The guys, much to his own surprise, the younger ones, the older guys, perhaps naturally a bit conservative, like what we had before. Younger guys, much to his surprise, don't go for digicam at all. They don't think that's good. And one of the reasons he cites on talking about this is he thinks that because they've been playing games, computer games, for at least the last decade or so, that sort of pixelated and digital camouflage that way has been out there quite some time. So it's not really that new for them. And they're looking at it like, oh, that works and everything. And there's lots of arguments for the pros and cons of digicam anyway, that it's not quite this God-given gift that some people argued about it. But one of the things with Caleb Cry and Tresida, they got together and he put across some of this swirliness that was on the original disruptive pattern material into 7 colours. Could you put something together? And Caleb Cry comes back and says, here we are, look at this one. And when that was put to the troops, they liked it because it was effective, it did well on the test, but they also liked it because when you're told it's a bit of a combination of that tradition of the DPM and a new camouflage scheme that we think is going to be better for you in multiple terrains of Afghanistan, everyone bought into that and they really like that. And so that's part of that psychological sell that you've got to do when you're talking about kit for soldiers, as well as you need the technical evidence. You can't just, make this sort of stuff up. So they got all that evidence with DSTL. And by December of 2010, the first of this new MTP, multi-terrain pattern camouflage material, is starting to be issued to the troops. It doesn't all get there in that. They wanted to give 4 sets. I think they only had 2 for most. And I can remember at the time as well, because this was always the thing I find a bit of an irony. we could have gone to some of those military affairs markets even and bought MTP patterned clothing, but we couldn't get it from the army because, even though we wanted to show it off when I was working at the Tank Museum, because this is part of that, keeping the public up to date with the new kit, some of the issues going on, etc. We weren't allowed to have it because it would have seemed a bit kind of, poor judgment to be giving it to a museum before even the guys in the field had all been issued with it, which you can kind of understand. But the irony is, again, usual story, even though it's in essence copyrighted, etc., by MOD, why is it everyone seems to be doing T-shirts with it on or anything else that way? That was one of the things that got me. So based on the original Cry multicam pattern, a mix of British ideas, new tones coming in there, 7 colours overall on that, and a cream colour that, again, you test all this yourselves and everything, but is tend to reflect back a lot of the local colour that you happen to be in at the time is part of the arguments. But again, on all the tests, very effective, and the soldiers really liked it. And it seemed to be, from evidence, to be successful in the field, because one of the intercepted Taliban messages, basically, you've got somebody in authority in the Taliban bollocking a local area commander saying, hang on, why is it all gone quiet in your zone? We're not getting the issues, the attacks going on that we expected. And he said it's because now they're wearing their new camouflage, we can't see them as well. So again, that was evidence that was picked up, intercepted in the field. So seems to be working that way from that point of view. Cry, again, Caleb Cry, one of those things that you may have heard the story. He emails Tresida. They've sent all the patterns over there, printing off, they're doing all this, they're making it all in all the various mills and everything. It's only later that he says, did you see, I've actually managed to put your name or your initials in the pattern, MT. Now go and have a look at this. You can find, again, if you go all over it, it won't be on every garment because the way patterns run, you can have a garment that's cut that doesn't have that piece on it, but you should be able to find an M and a T. Matthew Tresida, the guy who's initiated this program, and he was very honest and said, and don't forget, I was also very keen it was going to be called multi-terrain pattern camouflage because MT, that's his initials, Matthew Tresida as well. So he felt he got a bit of a win there. And he's very good because he has explained this on a number of podcasts and various other things about that process there. 7 colours. This one, if you count the black, 5, 4 normally, really say on that one. The 7 colours, it's the colours that are important. That's the thing to get across. And really the shapes, etc., they're helpful and they can work in certain areas, but it's really those 7 colours that make it effective in the way it is. And the British military, they've got their own, Cry's sold camouflage to lots of other countries as well, but that unique one, the MTP multi-terrain pattern, that the British Army uses, very popular, very effective, and of course now, what are we, 14 years, 15 years later since it went into service, it's being handed on, it's being developed all over the place into other variants relative to other militaries, etc. And it's interesting because just at the same time as well, the Americans were looking, they had that disaster with their own digital camouflage scheme that was supposed to be one size fits all type of camo, didn't really work very well, so they'd had to move on from that. And Tresida says when they presented what they were doing to the Americans, an American general got quite upset by all this because Cry and the American military hadn't got on that well so far. And of course, he'd been getting issues from senators saying, why aren't you using these very bright young lads set up in New York with their, very clever and nice new ideas, etc. And because now the British had come along and used it, of course, they were going to get, this poor American general was going to get even more earache. Why aren't you doing this and using them a little bit more? But it's the service camouflage now. British soldiers liked it. It was very popular when it went into service straight away that way. It's now being used. It's being used all over the place. As I say, some variations to match other countries' needs. Some is just being handed on, so you'll see it being used. British forces equipping Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainian soldiers, you'll be using that multi-terrain pattern. It isn't, and so we, back to what's the best camo? What's your issues? So it's not the best for all circumstances. This is still hugely effective, the old disruptive pattern material, but as has been found, though, why multicam went down so well, it's the best compromise that they thought they could come up with at that time. And we'll no doubt be seeing this in service, and no doubt getting modulated as time moves on, and perhaps with other variants coming in, depending on the circumstances where you're going to be looking at that. So I hope that kind of long-winded answers part of one of those sort of questions, and we can look at perhaps some clothing camouflage. And I mentioned earlier that one of the things, so I picked up this shirt in a local. I realised myself my only bit of the actual multi-terrain pattern I found, I've just been up in the attic rummaging around trying to find this, was on this paratrooper's helmet. There we are, 1998. So obviously the helmet made many moons before this. It's been issued and added with this MTP pattern that you probably recognise there. That's the only bit I found, but I thought if I was going to talk about this, I'd better have something. And I hadn't really, surprising my own self, had that much in the way of modern camouflage. I've got a suit of rubberized suit for keeping yourself dry in a vehicle. But this one I picked up again in a charity shop down the road. And why I mention this is because sometimes I've got the fortunate position to be a bit of an older guy. I've been collecting stuff all around the place, never spent a huge amount. But, sometimes you look online, you think, good grief, how much for some of these things? I would encourage, because if you are a collector and you like encouraging another generation to come and collect, which does us all good because it means our own material has value as well. It doesn't just all sit there and mould away. Other people want to understand this. Camouflage is a classic area where you can get material for quite cheap. You can build up a collection, show an interest, find about different variants, camouflages and dates, etc. that way. And you don't always have to pay a lot of money. So this shirt was £5, so £5 what's that, about $6-7. And this was, again, this smock that I picked up in very good order, that was also £5 in a charity shop locally, and that was all done within a week or so. So, that stuff's out there, so there shouldn't be an excuse, and about why we can't find ways of still enthusing the next generation and finding interest in our hobby, etc. Because there's always areas where there's something we can pick on and show an interest in. And camouflage, surely a very simple one that way. It's out there in vast quantities, and the different ones around the world now. Absolutely fantastic for something to be able to look into. Thank you, and I hope that answers the question, Sebastian.